In this module on assessment in the early years, I've made a deliberate shift to allow you to utilise a number of other resources. So there's a lot of resources that you need to access rather than just this the lecture notes. You'll see that there's a very powerful video there from probably one of the leaders in the field of education, educational assessment, Dylan William. This video is important for you to watch because Dylan actually outlines one of the big shifts in assessment that we have. So I think you'll benefit from accessing all of the resources for this week rather than just relying on this lecture. So this lecture capture is actually very brief and intentionally very brief to set you up to start reading and accessing those other resources. What we have got in assessment is, in the last few years, we've had what we'd call, I would say, a paradigm shift. We've gone from a process where assessment was twofold. We used assessment to summarise what students had learnt to report back to parents and to give us summative data about what had happened. So assessment was a practice in and of itself. There's been a massive shift in what we use assessment for. So we're moving much more now to what we call formative assessment. So we're using assessment as a feedback loop. So we talked about this in your planning module as well. So assessment now becomes a tool that you use to inform your teaching rather than to say, I have done this job well, or these kids haven't learnt it, or any of those other terms that we would use. What we do know are two really important things now about research, and you will hear the research on assessment, and you will hear this in schools across the board. Most departments of education are taking these two major pieces of research and building them into their reforms in education at the moment. The first one is Dylan Williams' work, which you have access to on the course site, and that's really about assessment for learning, and this is really important for you to get your head around. The other one is work by an Australian researcher, John Hattie, and his work has been doing meta-analysis of large-scale research projects. This is the first time that's done. Now, Hattie actually argues we've done a lot of research. It's been very diverse in foci, and he's been trying to make that all come back together. And his work actually shows two important things. One is that the teacher is the most important variable in educational outcomes. Not so much the school you went to, so it doesn't matter if you went to Brisbane Boys Grammar or if you went to Logan Central. What is important is the quality of the teacher that you had. So good teachers are everywhere. And he argues that what we do need to do is invest in our teachers. So that's good news for us as educators. It also is bad news because the government's also becoming quite concerned about poor teachers and what we need to do about that. So there's a lot of policy that's going around those two areas. For this work, though, in terms of our assessment module, Hattie actually talks about the importance of feedback. So again, that links in with Dylan Williams' work, Assessment for Learning. Hattie said that students need feedback to say how they're going. What we do know from the QSLRS study, the Queensland School Longitudinal Reform Study, which you've also encountered, is that schools are very good on providing supportive school environments. What teachers are very good at doing is saying, you're doing a great job, Johnny, you're trying really hard. Hattie's work actually says, and this ties back into the QSLRS study as well, is that it's important to provide feedback that enables students to know what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. So it's not good enough to say you're doing a great job. It's far too vague. You need to be able to provide them with feedback, assessment for learning, as to what they're doing well in terms of their mathematics. So those two areas are now foundational to much of the reform that's happening around assessment in schools. Two other terms that you need to be very familiar with are what we call summative assessment, which is the assessment of learning. So this is when you might do the final exam for a term or a year, and that provides us with a guideline of how well a student has done. The intent is not to provide them with feedback, but it's to provide, are they going well? And this ties in very much with the mandated assessment that you now need to do in schools, mandated reporting, where you actually have to assign students an A to E grade. So your summative assessment feeds directly into those A to E grades. The other assessment, which is very much tied to Dylan Williams' work, is formative assessment, where you do assessments to find out what students know, so then you can do interventions and scaffolding to move them forward in their understanding. So you need to know both of those. So the big push now is about formative assessment, but in terms of politics and government mandated reporting, summative assessment is also very important. So in terms of the early years, I've talked about exams and things like that. We don't do that in the early years. Most of our assessment, and one of the great things about early years teachers, is their observation skills. Observation tends to peter out as we move up through the years of schooling, sadly, because we learn a lot from observation of children as they're going about their work. So early childhood teachers need to develop acute observation skills. They also need to develop running records. So as they're observing students, or when you're in small group work, is keeping notes of what those students are doing, what they're saying, what they're struggling with, and so on, and keeping records of that. The other part of our assessment, these are the three main ones, is focused questioning. So when you're working with students and you're not really sure about what they're understanding, is actually posing questions to provoke the student to articulate what they're understanding. So again, coming back to our very first module, getting the students to reason mathematically and getting them to communicate mathematically is really critical for you to be able to now to do your focus questioning to actually tap into children's understandings. So those are the main assessment practices, and some of your readings will give you much more detail about that this week. The other important part is record keeping. You can be the best teacher and the best person in terms of assessing, but you need to keep records. You will have potentially 20 or more students in your classroom. What you'll often find once you start to do your record keeping, there are some students who tend to demand more of your time for all sorts of reasons, and then there's the other students who sit quietly at the back of the classroom, and they can be easily missed is probably a word I'd use. And when you do your record keeping, you will start to find that some students you have extensive records on, and some students you'll have minimum records on. So when you start to see that, you know you've got to go back and check on particular students in your classroom. There's more readings about this which you need to undertake to get a deeper sense of these different practices. Now finally, the thing that is probably one of the most contentious issues in education at the moment is national assessment. As an early years teacher, this only impacts on you in the third year of schooling. You need to familiar yourself with NAPLAN testing. NAPLAN stands for the National Assessment Plan for Literacy and Numeracy. And this testing, you can get a lot more information from the My Schools website, and which again is fairly political because all schools are now reported on against their NAPLAN testing. All students are expected to do NAPLAN testing, except for those who are given special exemptions. It is in literacy and numeracy. There is only one numeracy test, and I think there are 3 or 4 literacy tests, but I'm sure you'll get used to the literacy component of it. That's in your other courses, but there is only one numeracy measure. Now it's still contested within the field of maths education whether it is numeracy or whether it is mathematics. That aside, your grade 3 children will be tested on that numeracy test. So you need to be aware of the national assessment. I would urge you to be somewhat circumspect about it. It is only one day in a whole school year. So you need to be circumspect as to whether that really assesses the students. You need to be circumspect about whether the test actually does test numeracy. However, having said all of those things, it is something that is part of the educational landscape that you do need to be aware of, and that you as a teacher, if you're teaching grade 3 or 5, 7 or 9, you are going to have to implement whether you like it or not. So just be aware of it. It is there. You will find some schools may spend a month pre the testing to prepare their students for the testing. Other schools will just say, well, we just have to do it. So it's taken very differently at different levels of schooling as well. So just be aware of it. It is there, and it is going to be part of your role as a teacher in a primary school.